When you help pioneer a genre and become synonymous with its ups and downs throughout the course of 3 decades, you've earned the right to a victory lap. And that's exactly what Resident Evil Requiem feels like. The game unfolds like a greatest hits album that reflects on nearly every single entry in its long and storied history, pulling images, motifs, mechanics, and encounters from its past to create a tableau of action horror that feels like an oral history of not just Capcom's monolithic franchise, but of the evolution of the medium itself. Resident Evil Requiem is about a lot of things: the terror of the unknown, the scars of our past, the benefits of a good fanny pack. But most of all, Resident Evil Requiem is a Resident Evil game about Resident Evil games. It's a franchise that began with FMV intros, fixed camera angles, and cheesy writing.
Jill, here's a lockpick. It might be handy if you, the master of unlocking, take it with you.
Thanks. Maybe I'll need it.
And has evolved into a multimedia empire filled with Porsche sponsorships, the ability to switch perspectives on the fly, and cheesy writing.
You know, I do have a question. When's the last time you brushed your teeth?
And as a lifelong fan of these games, I had an absolute blast during my 2 trips through its campaign, even if some of it can get a little bit shaggy and nonsensical at times. But in all honesty, which Resi game doesn't? And it goes without saying, but this video will be spoiling Resident Evil Requiem as well as several other games in the franchise. Resi 9's opening continues the tradition of kicking off a Resi game with a non-combat section that sets a tone for what's to come, similar to Ethan's approach to the Baker house in 7 or everything prior to arriving at the titular village in 8. In Requiem's case, Grace's opening stroll down the dreary streets of Renwood might be one of the best looking bits of any game I've ever played, with the caveat that this is doable specifically because there's nothing to really do on this stretch other than peer into the bodega window and think about what the interest rates on a Viwa card might be. The start of the game also makes it immediately clear that Requiem is in conversation with the entire breadth of the Resident Evil franchise, and not just the beloved mainline games. Grace herself is the daughter of Alyssa Ashcroft, a character from the mostly forgotten PS2 co-op multiplayer game Resident Evil Outbreak, and this won't be the last time that Requiem references some of the more obscure corners of the series. Once you get control of Leon, you're tossed into a zombie outbreak bursting through the middle of a busy street that distinctly echoes both Resi 2 and 6's urban chaos, though I'm happy to say that Requiem is way more successful than 6 ever was, mostly because 6 was a bad video game and this is a good one. And though it didn't shock me they get a ton of direct nods to 2, I mean, I'd go as far to say that Requiem is almost like a direct sequel to 2's remake specifically, I was surprised at how many moments echoed 2012's disastrous 6th entry in the series, specifically when Leon later finds himself in the middle of a zombified war zone complete with getting control of high-grade artillery. Once the prologue wraps up and we make our way to Act 1's clinic, the conversation with Resi's past becomes even more apparent. The hospital's layout unfolds in a similar manner to the Spencer Mansion or Raccoon City Police Department, with multiple floors and arteries that fold back in on themselves to a central hall lined with staircases. We create shortcuts by unlocking doors, constantly revisit the calming respite of our save room, and run away in terror from wall-obliterating stalker enemies that make our first trip through the campaign a stressful one, not unlike Mr. X, Nemesis, and Jack Baker. Also, Leon finally joins Ethan in the Chainsaw Club, which feels like a payoff to a promise 20 years in the making.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
But one thing that makes this section stand out from what came before it are the unique zombie personalities, which make for some great emergent gameplay moments. In Resi 9, the enemies retain a sliver of their memory and humanity. Singers perform like nobody's watching, the chef hacks away at a chunk of meat in the kitchen, and this zombie, modeled after my dad, insists on making sure that the lights are turned off the second somebody leaves a room. My favorite is the cleaner zombie, who'll attempt to wipe away any schmutz in vain, considering how combat creates enough persistent blood and viscera across every surface of the clinic to the point where it starts to resemble a Basquiat. The game remembering your violence is only heightened with the introduction of the Blister Head transformations, a terrifying and welcome nod to the Crimson Heads of 2002's Resi remake. Gore aside, guiding a defenseless Emily across the clinic feels similar to protecting characters like Sherry and Ashley in their respective outings, and honestly, is it really a Resi game if our first rescue chopper doesn't run into trouble, if we don't solve a puzzle while getting our crank on, and if Leon isn't out here delivering excellent one-liners like the beautiful himbo that he is?
Excuse me.
After we move past the clinic and into the ruins of Raccoon City, it's no surprise that the references and echoes only get stronger. Having to fend off a giant spider made me remember just how much I hated those eight-legged freaks all those decades ago. And side note, the first Resident Evil will always be my favorite, partly for the variety of enemies on display. I love how the mansion feels like a Halloween Express crammed with spiders, pain-in-the-ass crows, sharks that have outgrown their kiddie pools, and a big ol' snake named Yawn. Thankfully, there are some nice deviations away from the more humanoid creatures here in Requiem as well. We get to prune the leaves of Plant 43, the final act is lousy with my beloved liquors, and of course there's Leon's joyride with the upgraded Cerberus pups and a scene that feels like it's ripped straight out of the 2017 animated film Resident Evil Vendetta, once again highlighting how this game pulls from every possible corner of the franchise's history. Of course, Resi 9 is not perfect. The characters sometimes make some bafflingly silly choices, like when Grace abandons Leon and decides to trust these two upstanding gentlemen who most certainly are not supervillains. I feel like searching for the detonator parts across Raccoon City goes on a few beats too long, though there are some fun moments here. I dug the first time zombies rose out of the dirt, I'll never say no to slanty skyscrapers, and I like how killing enemies rewards you with a point currency not dissimilar to a bout of Mercenaries mode. But the environments during this stretch lack the personality that was brimming from every nook and cranny of the clinic, causing this bit to sag under the weight of itself. But I'd be lying if I said that revisiting the remnants of Raccoon City Police Department didn't scratch a nostalgic itch in my brain that I'm still susceptible to and solidifies Requiem as a true sequel to the Resi 2 remake. There's an air of sadness as Leon wanders the halls of the building where his life changed 3 decades prior, at once a snapshot of the past as well as an embodiment of the toll that time takes on all of us. I mean, there's a secret locker filled with PS1 and Sega Saturn era Capcom games, though the absence of Mega Man Legends made this apocalypse even sadder. Apart from the retro games collecting dust, this area includes one last confrontation with a member of the Mr. X family, a flashback that lets us relive the horrors of the orphanage, and some blink and you'll miss it cameos from everyone's favorite hunk of tofu. And speaking of hunks, the boss encounter with the familiar commander helps make the bog standard third act trip to an underground research facility my favorite one in Resi's long history of bog standard third act trips to underground research facilities. While so much of Resi 9 looks inwards at its own franchise, it isn't blind to what's going on in the world of horror around it. The bombastic title cards that mark each chapter feel like they were pulled straight out of Remedy's playbook for Control and Alan Wake 2. Leon's quest to build a detonator across the ruins of Raccoon City unfolds like a micro-open world reminiscent of The Last of Us Part 2's Seattle, complete with a section where you have to navigate a precarious set of skyscrapers. And needing to extract the essence of fallen enemies for upgrades and crafting reminded me a bit of the green gel in the Evil Within, which was directed by Shinji Mikami, the grandfather of Resident Evil itself. But surprisingly, the game that Requiem reminded me most of isn't one of its survival horror brethren. Through its franchise self-reflection, extreme tonal shifts, and focus on a beloved protagonist who's slowly staggering towards his own mortality, I kept thinking of Metal Gear Solid 4. Revisiting a crumbling RPD filled with the ghosts of our past played the same notes as going back to Shadow Moses. Both games have us learning the tragic backstory of bosses once we've disposed of them, and as Leon began hacking up a lung and periodically losing consciousness in the final act, I saw visions of Old Snake crawling through a microwave. These are no franchises for old men. Resi 9 joins the likes of the aforementioned Metal Gear Solid 4, Final Fantasy VII Remake, and even The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild as entries in long-running and beloved franchises that are cognizant of their own place in video game history, while also having something to say about the road that it took to get here. Its highs matches the series' highs, and its lows occasionally dip into the red, but as a lifelong fan of Resident Evil since those two dogs crashed through those windows, I thoroughly enjoyed my time in this fittingly titled Requiem. It's a composition that honors the dead that came before it, while acknowledging that in the world of Resident Evil, death is never really the end.